now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
Dr. Blackwell, I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, but certainly never good night, never ever goodbye, because I hate goodbyes, don't you? My name is Rev Nathaniel W Martin, and pastor of the New Life Institutional Baptist Church here in Los Angeles, and we are located at 8916 South Main Street, right here in L.A., on the east side, right on the dividing line. That's what Main Street means. And we welcome you to our broadcast. This broadcast, of course, is entitled It's Time. And what it's time for? It's time for environmental justice. It's always time for social justice, social equity, social change. And that must always involve economics, because this world runs on an economic or capitalistic system, which we did not set up. But in talking about economics, we must always talk about reparations for past wrong, reparations for past injury, reparations to make whole, the reparations for healing of the victims of the concept and the structured racism that has abounded in this country from its founding, and from the pervasive influence and deleterious effects against black people of white supremacy. Yes, and this has been a very monumental week here in the United States of America, because we had a debate and a committee hearing on reparations in the Senate of the United States of America this very, very week. And so we are somewhat encouraged. A lot of pros, a lot of cons, and that is as it should be on both sides. And while I was happy to see the panel discussion, I know that there's a great battle, a great fight, a great struggle, a great conflict yet to be won by our people before we ever get an admission that reparations are due. And remember, we're only talking about the fact that reparations are due, which is separate from the questions of how these reparations shall be allocated. We first must get an admission by the national government, by the national society, that reparations for slavery, reparations for Jim Crow are due. A lot of people like to separate slavery from Jim Crow. They're one and the same. Excuse me. But before we get off too fast, let's read our scripture that deals directly with reparations from slavery. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, which I read every week, but I continue to read it, it says, beginning at verse 12, and if thy brother, and naturally by extension, if thy sister, excuse me, an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman be sold unto thee, mark these words, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let them go free from thee. I use the collective pronoun them to include both genders, male and female, because the verse starts out saying, if thy brother or an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman. Now, verse 13 says, and when thou sendest them out free from thee, thou shalt not let them go away empty. Thou shalt furnish them liberally out of thy flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress, of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto them. That is what the Bible says about slavery. Slavery was never to be perpetual. It was not to be eternal. It was not to be hereditary or any of those things as was practiced here in the United States of America under the guise of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And so we find out from the very beginning in which the manner of slavery was practiced in the scripture, that the way it was practiced in the 13 colonies that came to be the United States, and thereafter became the United States of America, the Union, following the devastation of a civil war to determine who was right and who was wrong about slavery. One thing we see that the United States, the 13 colonies model of perpetual servitude was unbiblical, unscriptural, immoral, and wrong, for it stripped a person of their selfhood, robbed them of their personhood, took away their dignity, took away their respect and their self-respect, and rendered them no more than mere property. As Chief Justice Roger Taney said in his epic 1856-1857 Dred Scott decision, where he made a very elaborate dictum as to what the condition or the position politically and socially of the Negro was in the country. Now, so we see that there was a dichotomy, there was a bifurcation, there was just a straight transgressing of the Judeo-Christian ethic that was practiced by the so-called Christians here in the United States of America. You had a lot of Christians that stood for slavery and fought viciously, valiantly, aggressively, belligerently for its continuation, for its perpetuation, and for its spread. And thank God you had just that many more Christians who fought just as stubbornly and hard against slavery being the rule in a land that was supposed to be based on liberty and justice for all, liberty and freedom. So that is why we have come to the point of demanding and petitioning the government for reparation. Thank God for Representative John Conyers, who for 40 years kept up this fight until he was forced to resign from the Congress. But every year he brought up this H.R. 40, which was a bill not to grant reparation, mind you, but a bill to study the effects, the consequences of slavery, and what reparations for slavery would look like. As Representative Conyers said, we study water, we study air. Why can't we study the consequences and the effects, deleterious and otherwise, the trauma of slavery upon U.S. citizens? Remember, slavery did not just impact the Negro himself, although it was bad enough, but it also deluded and miseducated the minds, and it deadened the sensitivity, the moral fabric of the entire nation. Because how can you hold someone as a package or as a chattel, which was a pretty word, which meant property, and not be dehumanized yourself? Of course, the books on the effects of a person who dehumanizes another also dehumanizes themselves, because you really have to deaden your heart. You have to really deaden your emotion. You have to really silence your conscience in order to do the dirty, horrible, cruel, brutal, inhumane things that were done to the people who were brought in chains, mind you, against their will, in the strongholds of ships, and stripped, kidnapped, stolen away from their homeland in the continent of Africa, and secreted in the depths of these awful ships and brought over here across the Atlantic to the shores of what we now know as the United States of America, coming to the 13 colonies in 1619 at Jamestown. And from there on, up until this present time, there has been a great Holocaust perpetuated against black people, against black bodies here in the United States. And many of our incidents of policing gone awry, law enforcement run amok in their enforcement of the law against black people, black citizens who also pay their taxes here in the United States, can be traced straight back to the pathology that obtained through slavery and post-slavery. Remember, the police were used to go out and arrest and bring back runaway slaves. Well, certainly that was the purpose of the police in the early years of this country, was to go out and keep the slaves in order, and if slaves escaped, then to issue warrants to go and arrest and find these slaves and bring these slaves bound back without benefit of hearing, without benefit of trial, without benefit of court proceeding, just on the word of the white police person or the white bounty hunter or the white slave catcher, what you will, that this person is a slave, and you are not viewed as a person, not viewed as a human. And so that was the early use of the police in this country, and sadly they have not gotten over that yet. They still view blackness as a crime. To be black in America, to be black during slavery was a crime. To be a black person in any locale, in any municipality, in any territory, even though you were free, was to be viewed with suspicion as to why is this black person walking around here without chains, without supervision. And that was even in the North, where there were stringent, very strict rules set in place to monitor the behavior and the conduct of Negroes, even though they were free persons, free men and free women. You had to be very, very careful. But I wish to get to an observation, as I said, that this week you had Ta-Nehisi Coates. You had no less than a luminary than Danny Glover and Dr. Julian Malveaux. Those three names come immediately to mind, as well as Mr. Burgess Owens, and other who spoke on the opposite side of the fence in opposition rather to slavery. That's the beauty of our country. You get both sides. But the panel presented the facts. They presented and made a petition to not grant, mind you, reparation, but begin a study of H.R. 40, which would put forth by, as we said, Representative John Conyers over the last 40 plus odd years, and as to the reasons why there should be reparations, and others stated the reasons why there should not be reparations. And remember, the higher up you are on the food chain, then quite naturally, the less you see the need for reparation. If you're a millionaire black person like Oprah or like some of these entertainers or athletes, then of course your position is different. But I feel that they should be able to what? Opt out of any recompense or reparation that is finally decided in favor of the people formerly who are the descendants of those formerly held in slavery here in America. If you're rich already, quite naturally you say, well, I don't need no more money. All right, you don't need it, so you opt out. But I don't want the rich house so-called servants to block us poor field servants from receiving our just due simply because that they have the microphone and the camera, and they feel that, I'm representing, I'm doing good, all y'all doing good. No, it's not the case that we're all doing good. One of the fallacies of this whole debate is that high tide lifts all boats. You got to have a boat when the tide comes in order to be lifted. And if you only have a raft and the other person has a $1 million yacht, hey, that's two different liftings. And even if you're lifted on the tide, you're still in trouble because you have to have the ability to not merely survive, but you need to be able to thrive like the people up there in the yacht. Otherwise, the yacht's going to run over my little raft and turn me over out there in the depths of the deep blue sea. But let us not wear out an analogy. Remember that all of this slavery and slaveocracy did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not end with the Civil War. The reason why we know that is because when the Reconstruction period began after 1865, we find out that by the time of 1877 that a horrible crime was beginning to be committed against the newly freed, newly franchised people. And the former Confederates who had committed treason against the country were pardoned by Andrew Johnson, and they were given back their lands, and which meant that they had the land and the former slaves now had nothing. And these Confederate people, former traitors, were bitter that they had lost the war. They were bitter against the Union, the North in particular. They were certainly bitter against their former slaves, whom they felt was still their property. And that's a mindset. That's a conditioning. You must remember that the false doctrines of white supremacy, the false doctrine of race, is a direct link between slavery and that doctrine. And the other false doctrines that white was a biological reality and that black was a biological reality, and all of these other false pseudosciences that were spawned or that were initiated to justify the continued exploitation and subjugation of the Negro now across the country. Because remember, New York, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Delaware, all of the states in many ways had made horrid laws that made life onerous for the newly freed slaves and their descendants, their progeny, their offspring. And yet, in spite of that, God granted that we began to lift ourselves up, as it were, literally by our own bootstraps. But that was not the norm, that was the exception. Because you find at the same time that the United States was giving away valuable land all across the country, especially across the west, northwest, just giving away the land to the white people, and that pattern continued on down through the Federal Housing Administration, which was set up some years into the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, in order to give the folks a break and a chance to get started after the Great Depression and the stock market crash of 1929. Let's not get into the weeds about that. The point to be made is that if America had been fair with the Federal Housing Administration, if America had been fair with the GI Bill following World War II, if America had even been fair with the initiation of the Social Security Administration, which was called Old Age Survivors Pension, give you a little something so you wouldn't be just out there with nothing. If it had been fair in those three areas, housing, GI Bills, give you for education, and to get loans to buy housing. If it had just been fair with those, and in the Social Security Administration, which even to this very hour, you have reactionaries in Congress who are fighting to block the poor and the elderly and the senior citizen from having even that little modicum of income that they get from Social Security. And remind you, they treat Social Security in the Congress, those that are reactionaries and want to block, stop, prohibit, and infringe upon the Social Security benefit. They want to treat it as though it were welfare. But Social Security, as you and I know, is not welfare. If you look at your check every month, you see where there is a deduction from your check that goes into the Social Security fund for the very fact that when you cannot work no more, if you get injured on the job, or if you become unemployed, or God grants you the opportunity to live to 65 years of age, then you have some money that you have paid into the system. I said you have paid into the system that you can have coming back monthly to help you at least keep your head above water. And God knows Social Security is not very much in this high inflation economy that we live in, where Western oil and Crisco has gone up. You go down there to buy a pair of underwear, price has gone up, even at Walmart. But let me not digress. But the point is the same. If America had been fair in the allocation of loans to all of the American people to purchase housing, but instead of just making a law that if you were black or Negro, you were redlined, you could not buy. You were not permitted to get an FHA loan. You were not permitted the privilege, the pride of knowing what home ownership felt like, and that the government of the United States of America was guaranteeing, was the guarantor of your loan. You didn't get a chance to have that if you were black, because even if you had the money for the down payment, which many black people did, the agent, the real estate agent, or the developer of the community was required by law to turn you down, because the fact said these loans are not for Negroes, these loans are not for black people. If America had been fair in that area, in that era, at that time, we would have a whole different conversation from what we have going on now. But because of the slaveocracy, and because of the effect and the influence and the lingering animosity and antagonism and the hostility of the people who had committed treason against the nation by trying to tear this country apart to keep slavery, and which having been defeated on the battlefield, now went back into the Congress of the United States and began to what? Rewrite the law so that the laws favored the segregationists, so that what they failed to win on the battlefield, they won in the halls of Congress. And so that is what we are dealing with. That is what we are fighting, and that is what we must have, reparations. It is not a separate, slavery is not separate from Jim Crow. They are both part and parcel of the whole wicked garment, the whole matrix. And those who attempt to say, well, no, you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, are living in fantasy land. As I said, no white person pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. The United States built land-grant colleges. They gave the land away free to the white people. They built land-grant colleges. They sent agents to help the white farmer learn what to plant and when to plant it. And they made them liberal loans to get started. None of that was permitted to its black citizens. And so that is why we have a claim against this government, against this land that we love, that in order to take away the blot and the stain of slavery, something has got to be made right. And it's not enough for people who come in and say, oh, I'm an immigrant, and I had nothing to do with that. If you are the beneficiary of the 14th Amendment, which says that if you were born in this country, or if you have a baby in this country, if you're a member and a citizen of another country, that child born in this country is a citizen, then you benefited from slavery. Sorry, nobody must be left out. We must all pay that cost. As we said, if the rich who have done well don't want to have anything to do with reparations, or don't want to receive reparations, they should simply just what? Opt out of reparations. All right. I've already gotten my notification of 5 minutes. I really didn't get very far, but I'm delighted to tell you today that we did have a hearing in the Senate on reparations. Again, as I get ready to close out, I want to encourage you to stay in the fight, stay united, stay faithful, stay hopeful, continue to study what you need to know in order to make an intelligent presentation about why we need reparation. And finally, if you're working for somebody and they cutting your hours and they cutting your pay, remember, if hard work by itself was what all that it took, then every slave coming out of slavery would have been a multimillionaire. If it was only about hard work, then every housewife would be rich. If they don't want to pay you for what you are doing, what you need to do is stop working for them. God bless you. God keep you is our prayer. Take us out here, Doc.
Some good days, and I've had some hills to climb. I've had some weary days, and some sleepless nights. But when I look around and I think things over, all of my good days, outweigh my bad days. Yes, they do. Outweigh my bad days. I just say thank you, Lord.